Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Welcome back to our series, Brazil, 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. The topic this week is Brazil, a welcoming country. And it's presented by His Excellency the Ambassador Ian Walcott-Skinner, Barbados Ambassador to Panama, and hosted by me, Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. This presentation is part of a free series of workshops, presentations, and discussions presented by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So, welcome back to this series. And I have here with me tonight Ambassador Walcott-Skinner. I think I will call Ambassador Walcott-Skinner Ian, if I may.
You can call me Ian.
Welcome, Ian. I know Ian, I guess since 2005 when I arrived in Barbados, because soon after I arrived here, I remember meeting you at some dinner hosted by the then Brazilian ambassador,
Yes.
Orlando. Yes, okay. So I will introduce Ian briefly to you so you know who will be presenting tonight, okay? So Ian Walcott-Skinner is the ambassador of Barbados to the Republic of Panama. Prior to it, he spent 5 years at a leading New York-based project management training and consultancy firm, the International Institute for Learning, where he worked in a number of management roles in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the USA. He is the former senior business development officer at the National Cultural Foundation in Barbados, where he designed, implemented, and managed Barbados Cultural Action Fund that provided project grants to the cultural and creative industries. During that time, he also served as one of the key authors and policy advisors of Barbados' current cultural policy. He also lectures in the disciplines of project management and project finance, business and digital analytics at the Taylorsville School of Business and Management Studies Department of the University of West Indies. Recipient of 4 scholarships for high academic achievement, a former Organization of American States Research Fellow in International Political Economy at the University of Brasilia, Brazil. Mr. Walcott-Skinner also spent 2 years in Japan's leading diplomatic school, the International University of Japan, specializing in comparative business and management, before returning to the Barbados Foreign Service. He has worked also in the areas of marketing, banking, and finance in Barbados, Venezuela, Trinidad, Brazil, and the USA. Apart from that, Ian is a registered translator and interpreter at the Barbados Language Centre. And he's also an avid collector of Caribbean and Brazilian art and has been involved in theater arts from being a child actor to becoming a playwright, critic, and director. Wow. Fantastic. There we go. So, Ian, over to you. So you said today that you will talk about your experience in Brazil, and I think we are all curious to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Are you all seeing my screen? Just tell me yeah.
No, not yet.
Yes, I'm seeing it.
You're seeing it?
Yes, I'm seeing it.
Okay. Are you seeing it, Marco?
Great. I'm in the wrong screen, I guess. But
Yeah,
go ahead if they can see it. I have to close all my windows.
Yeah. Just let me know when you can see it.
Well, you go ahead, Ian. I cannot see it here, but if people can see it, I will start it up.
Yeah, it should be one of your windows. Okay, good evening, everyone. Boa tarde. Today, I'm just going to share my beautiful life experience with you in a country that welcomed me for about 10 years of my life. First as a student, and then for about 5 years and then as a professional working for another 5 years. So, you know, you can stop me at any point and ask questions, but this evening is pretty much my story. I'm going to give a little background in terms of global migratory movements, just a very brief discussion on that, to share with you this notion that Brazil is not as far as we think it is. Barbadians have been going there since the 1800s, actually. And why we should not be afraid of Brazil because of, you know, the influence of Latin on English. Why did I go to Brazil? Why did I choose Brazil, or did Brazil choose me? I will talk a little bit about that. My life as a student at University of Brasilia. Here are some photos of Brasilia. This is the famous Brazilian cathedral in the city. And this was a modern city that was designed from scratch. So it's, you know, a fascinating place for those who love modern architecture. So a little bit about my student life, and that was in 1990. I know for those who were at community college or UE, 1990 sounds like really far away, you know, last century. Then going back to Brazil this century, my professional life in Sao Paulo for about 5 years, and some lessons learned. And I want this to be a conversation. We can exchange, stop and ask me at any point, anything. I'm not afraid of controversy. Feel free to stop and ask a question. So let's talk about some global migratory movements as a backdrop to the discussion this evening. The idea of the nation state, a Barbados versus a Brazil, a United States, in human history is a very new concept. It's actually a European concept. So if you go back, way back in human history, we have been roaming the planet like birds or animals. You look at especially the Arabian Peninsula, all of those migratory peoples on the continents, people have always been moving. The very story of Barbados, the Arawaks from that were the original inhabitants of the island of Barbados, guess where they came from? Today's Brazil. A lot of people don't know that. They actually migrated from Brazil. Obviously, they crossed the waters and inhabited the islands as we know it today. So there's this, and it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped. We've put up barriers. We have passports. We have borders. But there's mass movement as we speak going on the planet today. And I want to throw a question. Why do people move? Why are people moving across the planet? If you were to reduce it to one word. Don't all speak at the same time.
Let's say,
Sir,
yes, go ahead. We all spoke at the same time. Can someone?
I said adventure.
Adventure, that's one word. Great. Another word?
Say money.
Money. Okay. Another word?
Better life.
Better life. Yeah, survival. All the things that you talked about it's a question of survival. People, we move across the planet for survival. And I want us to put some dates in our heads. So we all know the history and the story of Barbados and how we got there as Europeans, how we got there as, you know, indigenous people. We now know that the Arawaks came from, you know, the continent, how we got there as African descendants, how we got there as Indians from India. We know the story of the Caribbean. With the abolition of slavery, starting first with the Haitian Revolution, then the English-speaking islands in 1834 to 1838, things were still hard. You know, the abolition it's a law, but until you start to have a change in mentality, it can actually take about 100 years. So coming out of that period after the emancipation, Barbados actually exported a lot of its people. So there was mass movement of Barbadians to Guyana, Trinidad, and believe it or not, the north of Brazil in the late part of the 1800s and the first attempt of the Panama Canal in the late 1800s. So go back to 1906, it's on record that some 40,000 Barbadians left to come to Panama to work with the construction of the Panama Canal. For the simple reason, survival. Barbados was a tough place. And I want to put that backdrop there because when you dig into your own family history, you may be surprised as to how many family members, if think about 1906 and 40,000 people leaving during the construction of the canal, some stayed, some went on to Costa Rica, some went on to Cuba, some went on to Jamaica. Survival, adventure, looking for a better life. Somebody in your family probably went to Brazil. Someone in your family probably went to Panama. So I'm saying that it is part of it's part of human nature. We are migratory animals. We go, so if it is too hot, if it is too cold, it's about survival. Yeah, so that's who we are as a species. And the reason why I'm giving this backdrop is because I remember when I told my dad that I got a scholarship to Brazil and, I'll be there for a few years. He said, Brazil? Why don't you choose someplace closer like England? That was so funny because I said, Dad, Brazil is actually closer than England. So you can understand that in his head, this is in 1990, England was closer for him because, being a former British colony, and Brazil seemed very remote. There were no direct flights. We had to go through Miami, some part in the US to get there. It could take at least 24 hours to reach Brazil, going through Miami sometimes. So in his mind, it's far. What do they speak? Do they speak Spanish? Do they speak Portuguese? Is this different language? And for the person who said adventure, I'm hoping that by the end of this, if you haven't visited Brazil, that you would be enticed to visit Brazil. I remember in the early days when I came back after graduating, I would go to community college and speak to students and encourage them to go to Brazil for us, to have a similar experience or adventure as I had. So when we look at Portuguese, as spoken today, it's one of the 5 Romance languages. And you see, and the reason why I'm showing this is very simple. The root of these 5 languages goes right back to Latin. So let's look at English. This other chart here. These are the languages that influence English. 29% Latin. So when you hear words like nation, that's Latin, a Latin root. French, programme, yeah? So, and the other 29%. So you're almost at 60% of our language that we speak as English comes from Latin and French. So before you start, you already have an affinity with Portuguese because of these similar roots. So, that fear sometimes that we have, we gotta go like, it's not that difficult a language. We have 60% of the language even before we start. So let me take you into my journey, how and why Brazil. So 1981, I am 12 years old. You can work out the math. I'm 53 today. I'm at Lodge School, a secondary school in Barbados, studying Latin in first form, Spanish in first form, and then introduced to French in second form. For those Brazilians in the audience, first form, you are 11 years old. Second form, you're 12 years old. So by 12, I'm doing Latin, Spanish, and French at the Lodge School. And one day, I go into the library and I see this strange language. And I'm like, So I said to the library, it looked like French. It had, accents that were familiar, but you couldn't look at it and say, well, how do you pronounce these words? These accents look really different. And I asked the librarian, I said, sir, what language is this? And he said, it's Portuguese. I said, okay. I said, well, that's the third language that I'm going to learn. So that's 1981, and I just put that out there. Fast forward to 1990, I finished my A-levels. In 1988, I'm at UWI. Not really excited about it. I wanted to do international relations. I'm working at Barclays Bank. And one day, I left the office during lunch, and I walked across the Sanjet House, and I walked into the Brazilian embassy. And, I said, can I speak to someone? And this guy, this diplomat, God rest his soul, bless his soul, Vamberto Ferreira, he was very helpful. And I said, in this innocence, this youthful innocence, I said, sir, do you have scholarships to Brazil? He said, have you heard something? I said, no. He said, well, we're about to announce scholarships for Barbadians and over the next 2 weeks. He said, what do you want to study? I said, I would really love to study international relations. He said, I know the perfect university for you. University of Brasilia, I'm going to do everything possible to get you there. He said, I have colleagues who teach there. I'm going to get you there. He said, and guess what? I want you to come here on evenings, and I'm going to start to teach you Portuguese. He's my hero. And as they say, the rest is history. So I go off to Brazil, get this scholarship, told some other friends about it, and we were the first set of Barbadian students en masse to go to Brazil on scholarship to study there. And then, 5 years in Brazil, I go off to Japan to diplomatic school.
Ian,
Yeah.
Ian, can I just interrupt you a little bit here?
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone is aware, but every year Brazil offers scholarships around the Caribbean, and especially in Barbados, for people that want to study in Brazil. So you were in the first set of people going, right? That is interesting.
Yes.
But I just want to make this point in saying, if somebody is interested in perhaps in the future study in Brazil, the same offer still is available every year. Brazil
very much available. All areas.
And you can study whatever you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Medicine. I have a cousin who is there. She's now a practicing doctor in Brazil. Architecture. Brazil is fantastic for architecture. Computer sciences is a fantastic place to study.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but
no, feel free to interrupt at any point, because there's a lot of information. Yeah, so, Vamberto Ferreira, and I still have those books today. Some of the rules of accents have changed, but I kept those books because, they meant so much. Like this totally unknown human being just took an interest in this young person walking into the embassy, all starry-eyed. The only thing I knew about Brazil was Pelé. And football and remember, this is before the internet. So we didn't have that kind of immediate access to information. So then I leave Brazil in 1995. Well, in 1994, off to Japan, then back to Brazil. And amidst lots of tears, and I'm like, one day I want to come back. One day I really want to go back to Brazil. And I will tell you again how the opportunity then presented itself in 2009. So it's almost like this was ordained. I just had to be there, the way how all of this happened. It's an amazing story. So 1981, there was the book. But before we get to 1990, something happened. It's the first time I'm getting on an airplane or Spanish teacher takes us to Venezuela in 1985. I am the president of the Spanish and French Club at Lodge. That's me at the back of the bus, probably giving trouble in Venezuela. This was our school tour, and I absolutely fall in love with Latin America, with South America, with Central America, with the culture, the smell of coffee, everything about it. You know, this impressionable young man at 16 years old totally falls in love with Venezuela. Not to mention that I had an aunt who lived in Venezuela. And as a kid, she would come home and I would hear her on the phone speaking in Spanish. And I'd be like, you know, one day I want to be able to do that. So you see how all of this is sort of making an impression on a young mind. So I told you about the embassy, and this is where the embassy used to be in Sanjet House. If you look closely here, this was the sign for the Brazil, either that side or here. This was the entry to go into the Brazilian embassy. It was there for a lot of years. And Brazil was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with a young Barbadian nation soon after we became independent in 1966. So they've been in Barbados since 1971, I believe, and speaking on the correction there. So 1990, I get my scholarship, a student loan, and I'm off to Brazil. This is a map of Brazil. So imagine coming from Barbados, taking a flight to Miami, coming across all this distance here into Sao Paulo. That's where the plane landed, and then into Santa Catarina in Florianopolis, where we learned Portuguese for 6 months. From there, I go to Brasilia, University of Brasilia, for the next four and a half years, where I did my first degree in international relations, French and German, and another master's and a master's degree in international relations, specialized in international political economy. And then a number of years later, more than 10 years later, I returned then to work in Sao Paulo. So that's my Brazilian journey. But what I want to establish here is that nothing was coincidence. And even where I am today, all of these experiences from the past represent preparation. That trip to Venezuela was preparation. That visit to the library was preparation. Studying at UNB was preparation. Working in Sao Paulo was preparation. So I want to share that, and all experiences aren't great, but everything in your past prepares you for now. And that's one of the wisdoms that I learned in Brazil. I was very fascinated as a young person. You'll be at the bus stop and you would be talking to the most simple of persons. And there was always this very deep understanding of life, a very philosophical, very spiritual outlook. It's interesting because before you came in, Marco and I were discussing the role of religion. And a lot of people didn't know that it's the largest Catholic country in the world. And that's now shifting. They're becoming a lot more Protestant as we speak. So very religious. We look at things like carnival, and we don't think of carnival as being ritualistic. The influence of African religions on Brazilian culture and how that manifests itself in the annual ritual of carnival. So, that's Brazil. Very spiritual, religious even, one of the most religious countries in the world, I dare say. So this is me here with the glasses, the only one with the glasses. This is around August 1990. So we meet all of these international students. Of course, these were the students from Trinidad. Philip is now a dentist who still lives in Brazil. Ansel is a vet who still lives in Brazil. That's me there. Nicholas is a vet. Some, Guyanese students. There were African students, European students. Fantastic opportunity here in the south of Brazil in 1990. This is the Trinidad, we call the Trinidad posse. Rhonda, she's back in Brazil, married to a Brazilian. Like I said, Philip is there. He is a dentist. And Cleve, he's an architect. He was one of, the older one. We were all, kind of like 18, 19, 20, 21. He was a little older than us. And he did architecture and then went on to Dominican Republic, where he did a master's in tropical architecture. So you see the opportunity that Brazil as a country gave to all of us, and the seed that was planted way back then. So this is my graduation from University of Brasilia, and here was one of my favorite professors, Manuel Montenegro, who is now Brazil's ambassador to Azerbaijan. This is a friend, Jeanette Carneiro. Her father, Aeneas, Marco, this is a daughter of Aeneas, who used to run for president of, who was a presidential candidate in Brazil a couple of times. Here's Denise, brilliant student, straight A's. She became, she has a PhD, and for a while she was a professor at Harvard, and now she's a professor at Northeastern, either Northeastern or Northwestern in the US, fluent English. So, very high standard of education, and you actually meet people that are at the top of their game and long-lasting friendships. So here's an interesting picture. This is, again, the graduation picture with our gowns. And an interesting thing about graduation is that each class organizes its own graduation. So I kind of graduated a year ahead of my group. So this isn't my group, my cohort. My cohort was a year behind, but because I had A levels, University of Brasilia waived a lot of my foundation courses. So these two pictures here, we were buddies, tennis. We played tennis together, swam together. So that's me in the back, and that's Alexei from Bulgaria. So, I mean, when do you meet someone from Bulgaria? All African countries. This is Aninho from Mozambique. He today has a PhD. Enrique from Uruguay. Very, at the time, I'm not sure about today, but University of Brasilia was the most international university in Brazil. For obvious reasons, it's the capital of Brazil, and it attracted, a lot of children who were the children of diplomats and ambassadors. Alexei's dad was Bulgaria's ambassador to Brazil. Enrique's dad was Uruguay's ambassador to Brazil at the time. So pay attention to these two guys, Alexei and Ian, and fast forward. Alexei today is Bulgaria's ambassador to Spain, and Ian is Barbados's ambassador to Panama. Again, is this a coincidence? I don't know. And we became ambassadors around the same time, and we all, we had similar dreams. He went off to diplomatic school in Madrid. I went off to diplomatic school in Japan. So, like I said, fast forward, my stint at the Foreign Service was very short-lived. I went into different spheres of, professional endeavor. And in 2008, I'm working with an American company. And my boss says to me, she says, Ian, I know that you're studying in Brazil, and we're looking for someone to manage our Sao Paulo office or Brazil office. do you know anyone? And I said, me. And she's like, are you serious? I'm like, yeah. She's like, well, how soon can you get there? I'm like, yesterday. And she goes back to New York, and in 2 weeks, she has me in Brazil. And here I am presenting and translating at a conference in Rio. And that starts then my professional career in Brazil, working there for another 5 years as the general manager of International Institute for Learning. And why do I say Brazil is a welcoming country? At no point did I have any type of rejection as a student, as a professional. Everyone was always very welcoming, and Brazilians are curious. Obviously they're going to hear a little accent. Where are you from? Do you speak Portuguese there? They can hear a little something. They're not quite sure. And then, once they learn that, well, you went to school with them at UNB, it changes the conversation again. So again, this is another picture here in Sao Paulo while working there. Very different experience. The first experience, I'm very young. I'm 21. I leave there when I was about 25. Got back to Barbados when I was 27, I believe. And then I go back, I'm 39. So I'm now an adult. You're not partying as much. Life is very different. One of the more memorable things, and I want to say this, when I got there in 1990, Brazil was going through a rough patch. And to just put things in perspective, if Brazil today has 200 million people, that's the size of the Roman Empire. So think of that complexity for a minute. And from the very tip of Brazil to the north, to the opposite tip in the south, is almost 8 hours flying. So Brazil was going through a rough patch in 1990. There was hyperinflation. Kids on the street is something that I had never seen, in my life. Very shocking. And there was a new government. There was a new president, President Collor, and Fernando Melo de Collor, and he was this new hope. He was young, vibrant, and things very quickly went south. And that was the first generation of what we call caras pintadas, the painted faces. I believe Marco might have been a student then. And the students from the north of Brazil to the south, to the center, southeast, they painted their faces, university students, high school students, and they went out into the streets and demanded that the president be impeached. Again, I've never seen that kind of protest. Yes, Marco.
Ian, yeah, I just want to put it also in context there. You mentioned the situation in the beginning of the 1990s and hyperinflation. Just to remind everyone that Brazil just came out of a dictatorship in 1985, and the country was in shambles and was trying to reconstruct itself. And we had the first democratically elected president by then, Fernando Collor de Mello. And I can also tell you that in those days, as you guessed rightly, I was a student, and I would get an allowance every month, and the inflation was so high that I had to go and buy US dollars in the black market in order to have enough money to survive until the end of the month, because things were costing, let's say, 10 today. You went to the supermarket tomorrow, it was 35, the same item or something.
Yes.
That's really crazy. So they had to change the money in the spot and go and spend it. Otherwise, there was no way around, and you would lose all your money to inflation. Just to put this in the context so everyone knows what you're talking about. Yeah.
So your salaries would then erode literally within 24 hours. So by the time I got to Brasilia, I'm living with a Brazilian family because University of Brasilia, they had this allowance, this where there, students can live with Brazilian families. Obviously, you paid for that. So I had a Brazilian mother, a Brazilian brother, and Brazilian sister. And I remember, my Brazilian mother just, as soon as she gets, well, she was already retired and getting a pension and stuff like that. She was pretty well off. But as soon as she got her money, she would go and buy a case of cooking oil, for example, because within 24 hours, it was eroding. And then, they changed the currency with the new real came and things stabilized for a lot of years after that. So one of my best memories as a student, so we could not participate in any form of protest. And as Marco said, Brazil was just coming out of a dictatorship. This was going back to being a democracy. So this is the first time that they're voting in a whole lot of years. There was this thing called Direitos Já, 1988, the new constitution. And that's an important day because that's 100 years, that's exactly 100 years after the abolition of slavery in Brazil, which was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. So it takes literally 3 generations, 100 years, until you have this new constitution that gives all of the citizens the fullness of their rights. So you look at the Caribbean, so we go from 1834, 1838, then we have the 1937 riots, 100 years later. You look at the US, 1865, slavery is ended, lots of turmoil, 3 generations, then you have the 1960s civil rights movement that gives more rights to the citizens. So you see, even though the law may change, it takes, literally 3 generations for real change to come about. And that's 3 examples in the Americas, the US, the Caribbean, and Brazil, where it literally took 100 years to get that fullness and a right to citizenship and personal sovereignty to feel as though you belong. And that fight still continues. So that was an interesting experience. So as a student, we had to sign, when we won our scholarships, one, that we wouldn't participate in any kind of political activity. And I remember my friends calling me and saying, Jan, come, let's go. And I'm like looking through my Brazilian mom's window, from, the apartment, just shaking at them because I couldn't participate. But it was interesting because you saw the power of people and their ability to rise up against tyranny and to change governments. So that was an interesting learning experience as well. So I will we've already into 45 minutes, believe it or not. So what are the key takeaways? The key takeaways for me that I will want to leave with you is be curious. I know as Barbadians, especially younger Barbadians, you're born into a country that's a lot more prosperous. I'm not saying that we've overcome all of our problems, but certainly a Barbados of 2022 cannot compare to a Barbados of 1922. So that push factor that pushed us to Brazil in the 1800s or pushed us to Panama in the early 1900s, it's not there anymore. But it's important to be curious. Be curious about food. Be curious about another language. And be open-minded. I have lots of stories about being open-minded. In Barbados, what we call pears, avocados. And I have an interesting anecdote about avocado pears because in Barbados, we eat Marco, as you know. For us, we use it as a salad. And we use it with cucumber, onion, black pepper. We slice it up and, it's really nice. So when I told my friends in Brazil, this is how we eat it, they go like, yuck. And, you know, Barbadians have the same reaction when I tell them how we eat it in Brazil. In Brazil, in some parts of Brazil, because there are many different types of, you know, culinary expressions and manifestations throughout Brazil. Brazil is a continental country. But in Brazil, they blend it with condensed milk, put it in the fridge, and it sets like a dessert. And you can share it, you know, it has a texture like very similar to ice cream. And it's really nice. So you can sprinkle maybe some cinnamon on it. And I told people in Barbados, this is how we eat pears in Brazil. They go like, yuck. So, you know, the same food, but it is treated differently, you know, in two different cultures. So that requires having definitely an open mind. And then finally, be willing to learn. Be willing to learn a new language. And more importantly for me, is be willing to unlearn. Learning is one thing, but then unlearning. And, you know, so I'm now in maybe country number 8. And trust me, it requires a lot of unlearning to be able to survive. It requires a lot of open-mindedness to be able to move around the planet. But this movement around the planet, where I started, is not new. It's part of the human condition. It's part of who we are. I mean, Marco is German descendant, and there's a long story as to, you know, the Germans got there at the end of World War II, when Europe was exporting people, when the refugees were from Europe. I remember a professor saying to us that at the start of the 1900s,
or even before, like in my case, my ancestors arrived in Brazil 1838, when there was a famine in Europe, and again they were looking for a better life. So
exactly,
it
survival.
much earlier. Yeah.
Survival. I remember a professor saying to us that, interestingly enough, in the year 1900, Brazil and Italy were at the same level of development. And he was or is Italian descendant. And he said the only thing Italy exported was people. So what happens when people move? Very often they turn up just with a suitcase, but they bring their culture with them. And it's that potpourri of culture, Europe, indigenous cultures, African cultures, because there's no one African culture. You know, they're from all different parts of Africa. That's the beauty and the richness of Brazil today. So that's it. I think I've taken up my 45 minutes. This is a beautiful picture of a city that was planned, that was built on the Central Plateau of Brasilia. University of Brasilia, which is considered one of the 16th best university in all of Latin America. And again, to Brazil, I will always be grateful because, you know, it helped to shape who I am today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian. So you are truly, as you said at the beginning, and referring to what you said, you are a native Bajan migratory bird, you know? So,
yes.
and a fantastic presentation. I see people already are ready to ask questions.
Sure.
Let's see. I see Sonia is raising her hand. Let's see. You can make, as you know, comments or questions, so feel free. Go ahead. You are muted, Sonia.
I apologize. Yeah. Okay. Now?
Yes,
Can
sure.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Miss Ambassador Welch.
Well, no longer. But it's good to see you. And that was I didn't come at the beginning, but what you were saying was very interesting. And I like your positive attitude to going places and learning about them and learning new things. One thing I was curious about, In Brazil, the issue of race
Yes.
is an undertone, not always an overtone.
Yes.
And I wonder how you found it and dealt with it. Let me tell you why I say that. When I went to Brazil a long time ago, I mean, yes, but I keep familiar and keep up to date with it. I remember I was going and everybody told me, "Oh, Brazil is great. There's no kind of distinction. Everybody gets on well. It's wonderful, cool." And we had a wonderful man who was a professor of applied mathematics. And I was in Washington at the time, and he used to come for meetings. And we got to talking a lot. And we had lunch. He said, "Sonia, I love my country. When you go there, be careful. You may not feel it, but there is that undertone in Brazil. So be careful." Because he told me that, I was able to maneuver my way easily. For what I've seen on the press, what I've seen, read about, it has changed tremendously since I was there in the 70s. It has changed tremendously and beautifully. But I want to know, how did you find it and how did you maneuver that walk?
Okay, so I am glad that you asked that question. And it would be disingenuous to say that racism does not exist in Brazil. That would be flat out dishonest. Um, what's interesting about navigating racism in Brazil was I was at University of the West Indies before, and your brother, Dr. Welch, I was in his history class, and he introduced us to this book by Gilberto Freire, translated
Yeah.
into English, called The Master and the Slave. In Brazil, it's Casa Grande e Senzala, which I think is a better translation is The Great House and the Slave Hut. They translated it as The Master and the Slave. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because I've read that book about 3 times. It's a very dense book. So I read it as a student in Barbados before going to Brazil in Dr. Welch's class. I read it when I got to Brazil as a student, and I read it after. And each time I'm learning something new about Brazil. So there's a very complex relationship with race and race relations in Brazil. I think one of the dangers is to interpret race relations in Brazil through the lens of race relations in the US, or even through the lens of race relations in the Caribbean. And that's not to say that there's less racism, but let me give you a very perfect example. I remember there was this guy at University of Brasilia, and he said to me, my grandmother looked like you. But if you look at him, you wouldn't think that he had a Black grandmother. So there's a lot of that in Brazil. So this notion, for example, where like Brazilians wouldn't necessarily call Beyonce Black, or they wouldn't call Obama Black. So within the context of North America, in the US, there's that one drop rule. You have one drop of Black blood, you become Black. It's almost inverted in Brazil. You have one drop of white blood, you become white. So recently, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, maybe 2 censuses ago, they actually had to encourage people to say, state their true race in Brazil, because, a lot of persons define themselves as white. They didn't necessarily define themselves as Black. So when you're reading literature outside of Brazil, and that's important because it has to start with a definition and how people define themselves. So I'm saying that if there's that negation, as we see it, of race definition, then that sort of nullifies almost strategically a potential race problem, if you see what I'm saying. Was there a whitening of taking place in Brazil? Yes, there was. A lot of research was done even on the Barbadians in the north of Brazil, who 4, 5, 6 generations later, they now have lighter skins, different texture here, but they still may have the name Motley, or they still may have the name Blackman because of intermarriage. So there's that complexity. It's one of the societies post-slavery, post-colonial societies that had a faster rate of Missionization, which we're now seeing taking place in the US. So the browning of the US that's now taking place, that pretty much took place 100 years ago. Fast forward to the last maybe 20, 30 years. Yes, because Brazil ended slavery in 1888, there were some things that still surprised me. Because, you know, we're coming out of the experience from 1834, 1838. Brazil is still 1888. So there, when I got there in 1990, there were still people alive to tell the tale of slavery. There were people still alive whose parents or grandparents were enslaved. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, very good friend, Mauricio, who was from the south of Brazil, I said to him one day, I said, you know, I feel as if I'm at school in Norway. And he said, what do you mean? I said, because, you know, when I look around, I'm not seeing Black Brazilians. I said, you know, the Black students that I'm seeing are from the Caribbean or from Africa. And especially the African students, a lot of them were obviously very well-to-do students, but where are the Black Brazilians? And he looked, and we were very honest. We, again, very open-minded. And for the first time, that was drawn to his attention, because in his mind, there was a normalization that you wouldn't sit in class with Blacks. One of my best friends, who's a pilot, he did international relations with us. He's coming to Panama to visit me this month, Marcelo. And he said the first time in his life that he was at school with Black students was at university. He said, and guess what? They were brighter than me. They spoke more languages than me. They traveled to, you know, more parts of the world than I did. So fast forward then, when I go back there as an adult, you are now seeing a lot more Black professionals, because obviously there's a feeder system. So you have to be able to get into the university. So something very odd took place. Brazil had something similar to the 11 plus when my Brazilian mother was a young person in the 50s, but they got rid of that. So most of the good universities are publicly funded, are funded by the government, but there are very rigid exams to pass to get into the university. So how do you pass those rigid exams? You go to a private secondary school. So you spend your money at secondary school, you get a very good education, you pass the exam to go into a federally funded public university. And then the opposite happens. So the poorer kids, who obviously, you can almost delineate this by race, you know, those who live in the slums or whatever, who cannot afford to go to a private secondary school, they go to a public secondary school, which isn't necessarily as good as a private Catholic school. So then they don't pass the exams to go into a federally funded university. So they end up going to a private university, some of which are not as good as they. So it's totally like inverse. And I think a few iterations ago, in terms of governments, they actually tried to correct that. Do they still have a lot of work to do in terms of race relations? Yes. My cousin is there. She's a practicing doctor, and she's had experiences where person said to her, don't touch me, and she's Afro-Caribbean. She isn't mixed, she's Afro-Caribbean, she's Barbadian. So yes, there's still some issues, but I didn't find it as necessarily aggressive. That doesn't make it less invasive, because we know that microaggressions can be just as traumatic as macroaggressions. I hope I answered your question, Ambassador.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say that I like your broad approach to it. It is complex, fascinating. They really have been amazing changes over the years. But I guess because I was living in Bahia,
Yes.
I saw right center. It kind of shocked me coming from Barbados at the time. It didn't hurt me because nothing bad happened.
Right.
Things that I perceive, for instance, years ago in Barbados, when somebody said, "Oh, you have good hair,"
Yeah.
and I was shocked to see that in Brazil, I had the same concept in Portuguese.
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know, so a lot of things that I saw were the post-colonial things. But as you said, reading the Gilberto Freire and reading his works so help you to feel it and see it and compare and contrast. But
Yes.
it's a subtle thing. You have to understand it. It operates at different levels. And you have to understand it. Don't judge it. Understand it. But they have made amazing progress, and I hope they will continue, because I think once Brazil makes progress in that matter, then the whole of Latin America will have to kind of improve. But
yes,
this is something we can talk about forever. So another time we can get together
Yes.
perhaps and talk.
well, thanks
It's a
for
very-
your intervention. and
It's a very
your brother was very instrumental in helping to shape my mind towards Brazil as well.
So it
There is no
benefits
doubt
of
this
you.
is. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there is no doubt this is a very complex topic, and we could talk all night about it. And I would like to add my 5 cents to it as well, Ian. There obviously is racial discrimination in Brazil, as there is also economical discrimination against the poor. And it just happens that the majority that are poor are Black as well. But I think in your personal case, you had a very positive experience. And one of the reasons might also be, I'm just guessing, is Brazilians in general, they have a very positive attitude when they learn somebody is foreigner. And the attitude becomes much more positive. For some reason, Brazilian love whatever is foreign and is always welcoming, right? So I guess people that are Black in Brazil and are Brazilians that live in a shantytown, for example, they would have a completely different experience. So it might have helped you also to have a better experience just for the fact of being foreigner. It's also one of the things that comes into this complexity as well. More recently, we had more like discrimination against foreigners, especially Cubans, Venezuelans, for the economical reasons and then for political reasons and so on. But in general, Brazilians have a very positive attitude towards foreigners, right? Okay, so it's already past 7, but I would like to hear if somebody else has a question or comment.
Sonia's hand is still up. Oh, okay. I see Paul. Paul, why are you so quiet?
Marcos, I have a question.
That's
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Marcia, let ladies go
Two
first.
people
Marcia
are
will
talking
say
at the
something.
same time. Marcia, yeah, go ahead, Marcia.
Okay. I was a student at the time, yes, when Fernando Collor was president, and then he was sent out of presidency, I have to say. I was trying to remember how many times did our money change at that year, because we had Cruzado, then we
Yeah.
had Real. Was it three
Mhm.
times? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
3 times. I think when I got there, it was Cruzado Novo, and then the Real. So I
Oh,
experienced 3 currencies
yes,
in a very
yes.
short
Okay.
period.
I just don't
Since
remember. I
then,
was trying to
since then we have stability and just the real. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
since then we've had the Real. I hear me saying we.
yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Of course, that is correct. Okay, Paul Blackman, please.
And then Sonia again.
Yeah.
Paul?
Pauline,
Milton?
Pauline.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I just apologize. I'm actually having my dinner, so this is why I was being very quiet. But it was an
You should
excellent
share
presentation.
it. You having macaroni pie?
I wish I was having some avocado pear, but not that thing that you described though. That sounds a little risky, as my wife says.
Yeah.
Anyway,
In Brazil,
let's
we only associate avocados with sweet and not salt.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Sonia?
Yes, Sonia?
Ambassador Welch.
No, it was in my day. Don't tell me how far back it goes. It was the Cruzeiro. Even Cruzado. It was the
Yes.
Cruzeiro. Oh, how far back I go? Okay.
Actually, we also had from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the late was it Roseanne? Roseanne
Fantastic.
Osborne.
Mhm.
Yeah, who went to Itamaraty, Marco, and they still talk. Well, up to when I was there in 1990, they still talked about her. She taught the class. She
Yeah.
taught the class at the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy. Well, of course, she was a Barbados scholar as well. Unfortunately, she's passed away, but she was one of our stars in the Barbados Foreign Service, and she was trained at the Diplomatic Academy, the Rio Branco Institute in Brasilia, and she taught the class.
But anywhere where there's a Brazilian embassy and people of a certain age, not so much now, they always ask you if you know Roseanne Osborne.
Yes.
She left her in the walls of Itamaraty, a Barbadian
Yes.
woman. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll lower my hand now.
Okay.
Fantastic. Anyone would like to ask the final question or comment? Doesn't seem so. So, okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight. And thank you very much, Ian, His Excellency Ambassador Ian Walcott-Skinner.
Ian is fine, or Jan. Jan is fine.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was very interesting. I think we learned a lot of things about Brazil as well through this personal experience that you brought here today. So it was interesting. And as usual, we always learn something about Brazil as well. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much. So in the name of the Embassy of Brazil and the Barbados Community College, we thank you very much for doing this presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to your election results and my next visit to Brazil.
I think we all do. And actually, we had elections last Sunday.
Yes.
And the election went to a runoff. So at the end of October, we'll finally know who the new president of Brazil will be.
Yeah, so we're waiting with bated breath, I can imagine. And then, of course, there's the World Cup.
Yes, that is another story.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you very much, Ian, and
Oh,
see you
okay.
next week.
Good night.
We will bring a new topic next week. Good night, everyone.
Okay.
Ciao,
Good
boa
night.
Boa
noite.
noite. Boa
Good night.
noite.
Night all.
Boa
Ok,
noite,
bye.
obrigada.